Good afternoon, Emily. You're seeing and hearing me clearly? Good.
Yes, we're ready to start.
All right. Well, thank you everybody very much for joining us today. I'm Peter Howe. I'm president of the New England Canada Business Council, and on behalf of the entire board of directors and staff of NECBC, we want to welcome you today. We so appreciate your participation today. I think for all of us, we've learned in the last couple of years that a reasonably open, friction-free border is like good health. You never really appreciate it until it's gone. And when it is gone, boy, do you want to get it back. So this is a very timely and relevant event, thinking about how do we try to get back towards the new normal, whatever the next version of COVID normal will be, for moving back and forth between our two countries, which are so close. I want to note with gratitude the sponsorship of the Consulate General of Canada in Boston for today's event, and also the support from the government of the province of Quebec for the research that we will hear. I'm thrilled that Dr. Christopher Sands from the Canada Institute at Wilson Center will be moderating our panel discussion. NECBC, huge friends of the Canada Institute and great admirers of the work you do. And I would like to introduce, to kick off today's webinar, Marie-Claude Francoeur, who is Quebec's representative in Boston. She has been in this office since 2014. I learned this week you're in your second term. Marie-Claude, we hope that you will never leave. You've become a wonderful friend to all of us in New England, and a wonderful connector between Quebec and New England, a wonderful spokesperson on issues of energy and clean energy transformation, francophonie, innovation, all the ways that Quebec and the New England states, and really all of Quebec, Atlantic Canada, and New England can grow more closely and more prosperous together. So Marie-Claude, let me turn the microphone over to you to kick us off, and thank you.
Merci, Peter. Chers amis, dans les périodes difficiles, l'union fait la force. If this crisis has shown us anything over the last year, it is the strength and the depth of the relationship between Quebec and our friends from our neighboring states of Maine, New Hampshire, New York, and Vermont. Together, we have faced a multitude of ups and downs and joined forces via two task forces. Members of both groups are here with us today. Bonjour à tous. It is a privilege to work with you and an honor to have you join us today. Let me walk you through a few of the collaborations of the past 2 years. First and foremost, the closure of the border brought a host of challenges at the subnational level. The closure and eventual reopening of the border are, of course, federal matters. However, the implementation of the sanitary measures is the responsibility of the provinces and the states. Quebec shares more than just a border with northeastern United States. We also share a history, a cultural heritage, definitely DNA. We share the same air, soil, and water. Of course, we are great economic partners, but our bonds run deeper than that. We are friends, and truly, we are family. And as with any family, our goal in March 2020 was to ensure the safety of all our friends and neighbors, offer our help when needed, and sometimes a good shoulder to cry on. My office convened a working group at the policy level with Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont to share information efficiently so we could better prepare and respond. We exchanged on best practices, sanitary measures, vaccination rollout, name it, we talked about it. Now that the border is open, this channel of communication enables us to inform our populations of the measures and restrictions put in place on both sides of the border to ensure a safe and smooth travel experience. As you know, guidelines change often and differ from one country to the other, one province or state to the other, and even from town to town. I am happy to report that we have been able to deal quickly and effectively with everything from agricultural inspections to cross-border transactions in a timely manner, keeping people safe and ensuring commerce continued to flow freely. The Quebec Government Office in Boston also joined forces with New Brunswick and the Northern Border Regional Commission. The NBRC is a major economic development agency in our region, and the only one that covers all 4 states that border Quebec. With federal co-chair Harold Parker and executive director Rich Grogan, we have convened the NBRC along with representatives from Quebec and New Brunswick to keep our economic development professionals up to speed on all evolving issues regarding the border. When you think of it, It is the combined GDP of the NBRC states, Quebec and New Brunswick, that reaches 623 billion US dollars, which translates to the 24th largest economy in the world ahead of Sweden and similar in size to Taiwan, Poland, and Belgium. Quebec and the NBRC states trade $12 billion a year. With the pandemic, we had to find a way to enhance our competitiveness and protect our integrated value chain. This need was the spark that ignited the North American Rebound, a campaign founded by leading trade voices in Canada and the United States to address protectionist tendencies in the wake of the pandemic. The 150 plus signers, representing nearly 3 million employees across the US and Canada, believe that both countries must promote a common cross-border manufacturing response to tackle COVID-19 and its consequences, including inflation. Quebec has been part of this campaign since the beginning, and we invite you all to join and sign up. The NECBC was one of the first signatories. Merci. And Peter will put the link in the chat box. The North American Rebound is an example of Quebec government's firm belief in the free trade and complementarity of Canadian and American economies. We are fortunate to border states that hold the same belief. We don't always see eye to eye, but through ongoing dialogue, we always find common ground, and we have developed some strong partnerships driven by shared goals and values. When the American government imposed tariffs on Canadian exports of aluminum in the summer of 2020, the governors of this region mobilized and exemplified those values to protect the well-being of their workers and their families. And I do want to express my deep appreciation for their pragmatic and constructive intervention with regard to this commercial dispute. I am sure their efforts proved decisive. It is by working together that we will jumpstart our regional economy to compete with other regions of the world in a rapidly changing global environment. This crisis has shown us how resilient we are and how creative we can be. We found innovative ways to do business, and we adapt to new situations at lightning speed. I cannot wait to hear our speakers exchange on the lessons learned, and more importantly, on how this experience has made us stronger and more agile. I'm curious to hear what their envision for the future of our region as we slowly turn the page on this historic period and begin writing a new chapter. To moderate this panel, it is my privilege to introduce a person that has worked diligently over the past 2 years to keep our governments communicating and to reopen the border in an efficient way. The Wilson Center put in place a task force on public health and the US-Canadian border. The task force considered the effects of the border restrictions and recommendations to current and future policymakers. Chris Sands is the director of the Canada Institute at the Wilson Center, the driving force behind the task force. He is an internationally renowned specialist on Canada and US-Canadian relations and adjunct professor of Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. He regularly gives testimony to the US Congress and the Canadian Parliament. He is a widely quoted source on Canadian affairs and has published extensively over a career of more than 25 years in Washington think tanks. We are privileged to have Dr. Sands' perspective today and grateful for leadership on Canada-US relations. Dr. Sands, the floor is yours.
Un grand merci. Thank you very much, Marie-Claude. That was very kind. I note that I have to amend my bio. When it says I've been working for more than 25 years, it's just advertising that I'm old. I don't think that's maybe the best way to lead, but I really appreciate the warm introduction. And I also want to thank Peter Howe and the New England Canada Business Council because your work is an inspiration. I'm really pleased to be able to work with you and with the Canadian Consulate and the delegate here. We did put together a task force to look at the Wilson Center at public health in the US-Canadian border. And we put it together because we knew from the beginning that this was going to be an important moment for the Canada-US relationship, a test of the relationship. After 9/11, when we did have some border disruptions and we added to our border security at the border, we were creating barriers to market access, not intentionally. We weren't trying to affect the economy. We were trying to keep people safe. And in the same way, the last 2 years, none of us thought it was going to be 2 years long, have shown us that changes to the way we manage the border for whatever purpose do affect the business community and have serious implications for people's lives. Our task force report highlighted just a couple of things that I think are relevant to today's discussion. And they really pointed to missed opportunities over the last 2 years. Some of these I think will resonate with our audience today. National legislators, particularly the Northern Border Caucus, members of the House of Representatives in Washington, but there were many senators from the 11 states that have a border frontage in the United States, were largely marginalized as we move forward. This was our border policies were managed by the executive branches of our federal governments and principally by public health authorities. But there were people who, as legislators, should have been empowered to speak to local conditions and to people's concerns. There could have been much greater coordination with local levels of government. When we look at the border, we think the federal government, because of course our federal governments manage the border, but states, provinces, cities, communities, all have a bigger role to play, all have assets that they can contribute to managing public health and managing the economy, and they were largely disengaged. There was also an opportunity here that we have failed to take much advantage of to do partnerships with the private sector and test pilot projects, see if there are ways that we could make the border work better. We don't have a great facility for pilot projects. We did, but after 9/11, but we could have done more to experiment and look to the private sector for solutions. How could they meet our test and work together with us better? And also, the task force identified local conditions as being so important. We can't have a one-size-fits-all border policy, but we do have a one-size-fits-all border restriction because of COVID. And yet the conditions in Point Roberts are different than the conditions in Detroit, are different than the conditions in Boston and New England. And that failure to incorporate the local really made what was already going to be a difficult 2 years that much harder. But we're going to correct that. And I know we're coping with the Omicron variant now. There may be other variants to come, but it's high time as we approach the second year mark of these restrictions that we begin to improve this area of policy. We never know how long we're going to be dealing with COVID, but we can certainly say that after 2 years, we should have learned a bit. And we have a panel today of some of the scholars who are out there doing the research on the ground with insights on how after 2 years, we can do a better job managing the border. Our panel is very impressive, I have to say, and I know some of them personally. I know their work, and we're really in for a treat today to hear from what they've been working on the ground. Our first speaker is Christophe Cloutier-Roy, who is acting director of the Center for United States Studies in the Chaire Raoul Dandurand at the University of Quebec at Montreal. We also have Laurie Tanous, who is a special advisor, Customs and Immigration at the Cross-Border Institute at the University of Windsor. Jeffrey Ayers, who is chair and director of the Center for Global Engagement at St. Michael's College in Vermont. Stefano Tirina, who is a lecturer in management at the Maine Business School at the University of Maine. And they're going to speak, as I have it on my list here, in exactly that order. And so without further ado, can I turn the floor over to you, Christophe?
So thank you very much, Dr. Sands, for this introduction. I know our time is short, but I have to thank some of my colleagues at the United States Center to help me for this presentation. So Jean-Daniel Roy-Trudeau and Félix Lemieux, who helped me gather the data that I will use in my presentation. I will do a short presentation to set the stage of the main consequences of this border closing. And of course, we can expand on the discussion after that. So as we may remember in Canada, following Donald Trump's victory in 2016, there was a mild fear in Canada that an incident at the border between Canada and the United States could lead the Trump administration, Trump of course being a known border security hawk, to greatly tighten the border between the two countries. Of course, what happened later is that we did see a closing of the border, but not for the reason that we may have expected. Not for terrorists coming to the United States from Canada, not for drug smuggling, not from illegal immigration, but of course to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. What is also surprising is that it was not a unilateral action, but a common decision that was reached by the Canadian and American governments. And so, as you may have Dr. Sands, we may have learned some lessons from September 11th. So there was a higher level of coordination between Canada and the United States. Also, and very crucial, there was a distinction that was made between commercial and non-commercial travels. And also the measure that was announced on March 20, 2020 was to last only for a few weeks, but of course it could be renewed several times. And of course it has been renewed several times after that. So the decision that was made by the two government was at the origin praised by analysts. It was seen as an efficient way to curb the international COVID transmission, and also it was seen as a good example of international collaboration on COVID. And this was, we are remembered, at a time when Canadian-American relationship was going through some kind of a rough patch after the hardship of the negotiation around the USMCA. So I had some slides to show. I don't know if they are available. Yeah, thank you. So here's a quick recap of the main of some of the measures that were adopted throughout the pandemic. So I have to give a huge shout out to the task force of the Wilson Center on the Public Health and U.S.-Canadian border, who did a thorough job of documenting what has been done throughout this whole COVID phase and the measure that were adopted. So after the closing of the border, it was announced on March 2020, the Public Health Agency of Canada decided that it will be mandatory for Canadians going back to Canada to have a 14-day quarantine periods. Many exemptions were added later to this measure. Also, the United States, contrarily to Canada, continued to admit visitors that went by way of air. So this was a difference between the two countries. But starting in January 2021, there was the mandate that visitors could present a negative PCR test. In the summer of 2021, with the receding pandemic, the Canadian government decided in August to open once again its border to American visitors. But as the United States were in the midst of the Delta phase of the pandemic, they decided to delay this reopening, and it was met with a huge criticism, especially from the Northern Caucus, that you allude, Dr. Sands. So it was not until October that the United States decided once again to admit Canadian visitors. And as a last measures that we must say, and it's not on my slide here, of course, is the decision that has been made by both Ottawa and Washington to ask all truckers coming from one side of the border to another to be fully vaccinated, as they were exempted earlier. And of course, this could have lasting consequence, which we will allude later. So if I could go to the next slide. So as we come to the economic impact of the closure of the border, as I said earlier, it was the decision to make a distinction between commercial and non-commercial travel seemed to have paid off, since the decrease in bilateral trade has been very limited in time. We can see on both the figures here that it was mostly concentrated on the second quarter of the year 2020. So most of the last decrease in bilateral trade were in the beginning of the first wave of the pandemic, when every industry was adjusting to a new reality. And since then, rapidly, we've grown back to quasi-normal level of trade between, United States and Canada and Mexico. So in that way, it seems to have been somehow fairly good news. And here I'll go to the next slide. However, the tourist industry has been a notable exception about this. It has been not spared by the closing of the border, considering that pre-pandemic, land travel accounted for more than half of overnight visits by Canadians in the US. So we can see here the impressive decrease in land crossing by Canadians in the Northeast region in 2019 and 2020 and 2021. So we are far from going back to the pre-pandemic level. And in July 2021, the US Travel Association has estimated that the United States have lost a monthly average of $1.5 billion in potential travel exports. So I will go down to my final slide. So the New England region, and including here upstate New York, was especially vulnerable since tourism, as we know, is an important industry, and Canadian visitors are an important source of revenues. So as the example that we could say, for example, Maine is a state that received annually 4.5 million Canadian visitors each year before the pandemic, and the state saw a $6 million in revenue lost on accommodation and restoration between 2019 and 2020. And of course, the states, the which is a very important maritime state, suffered from the ban by Canadian government on leisure cruise. Many cruises coming from the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River that did not do a travel to Maine. In New York, the Chamber of Commerce of the Champlain County has estimated that there was a $310 million in revenue loss in 2020. Champlain County being the county where Plattsburgh is located, and Plattsburgh, of course, dubbed itself the American suburbs of Montreal. So many lost in shopping by Quebecers that went to Plattsburgh. In Erie County, in Buffalo, the figures are between $665 and $855 million in revenue lost. In Vermont, it is estimated that the tourist industries have lost $700 million between March and December 2020. And at the Burlington International Airport, we saw a decrease of 70 to 80% in air travel out of Burlington International. And we should be reminded that pre-pandemic, 40% of air travelers in Burlington hailed from Quebec. So, of course, that was very significant. And meanwhile, in Canada, Statistic Canada had estimated in October 2020 that revenue loss from travel restrictions could range from $26 to $37 billion, and impact between 383,000 and 559,000 jobs. And in Montreal in 2020, we saw a 90% decrease in revenue from international tourists, so not only Americans, but throughout the world between 2019 and 2020. Fortunately, in Quebec, local tourism from Quebecers that were, from a lack of a better word, stuck in the Belle Province have helped to partly mitigate the loss on the revenue from tourism. So to conclude, while it would be very surprising to see another closing of the border, at least during this pandemic, we have to be on the lookout for a couple of challenges ahead. So first, of course, there are still all uncertainties that remains regarding COVID. So we saw what happened with the Omicron wave that was somehow unexpected, at least by the government, it seems. And also the fact that the many legislature, the many states, provinces, cities, national governments have very different ways of doing sanitary measures. So this could be a challenge ahead. And of course, the effect of the mandatory vaccination for truckers that I alluded earlier. So for now, there are no shortages that are announced in the grocery stores in Canada, but since 15% of truckers are not fully vaccinated, we have to be on the lookout for shortages and maybe an effect on inflation in the coming weeks. Also, there's the invisible impact of the pandemic, the fact that in-person meeting and with networking activities have been less prominent in the last 2 years. So many business links that were not done during this time. So this, of course, is hard to quantify, but we may see less partnership in the coming years between Canadian and Americans. And finally, we have to be reminded that tourism is an industry that is known for its slow recovery pace. So we know that following the September 11th attack, it took at least 5 years for the tourism to go back to the state that it was before the attack. So we are probably looking to a windows of at least 5 years before a return to the pre-pandemic level. So I will now yield the floor and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christophe. That was an excellent presentation, and your research is really a tremendous contribution to public policy in both countries, I think. We now move to Laurie Tanous. And Laurie, before I hand over the floor, I just wanted to say for those of you who are watching, as you're listening and you're thinking of questions, there is a Q&A function on this call. So feel free to put your questions there. And we'll do Q&A after we've had all the presentations. But if you have a burning question, start writing it now, and we'll come to that a little bit later in the program. Over to you, Laurie.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation to be here today on behalf of the Cross Border Institute at the University of Windsor. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Prior to my becoming a cross-border attorney, I was a customs and immigration officer for the Canada Border Services Agency. And now I'm dating myself, Chris, but at the time that I was there as an officer on the ground, that's when 9/11 occurred. And I recall that day like it was yesterday, when the border had to be closed, when we were literally in fear from a physical safety perspective. And looking now at these 2 past years, nobody, just as my esteemed co-panelists have said, nobody expected that border would be closed for 2 years. The difference, I think, between these 2 events is that right after 9/11, the Canadian and US government mobilized rather quickly. We saw introductions of things like CTPAT and PIT, Partners in Protection, on the Canadian side. These trusted traveler programs on the commercial side were worked on behind the scenes, but the border remained open. Okay, so when you think about that in that context, so we were not prepared for an event like that was a threat to national security, just like we were not prepared for COVID and the threat from a public health perspective. I think what we've seen here is really an identification of how fragmented our border policy really is. I have I guess I'll call it the luxury or the privilege of working day in and day out with importers, with businesses, with people who need to physically get across that border. Okay, and what I've seen in the last 2 years is we can I guess put them in different buckets. You've got the personal side of this, meaning the families that literally were torn apart. I could probably write a book after all this, from the emails, text messages, calls I receive on a daily basis of people pouring their hearts out, saying they can't see their children, they can't see their parents, they have dying family members. It's been horrific. And to say that we couldn't have come up with a better way to do this, I think, the hope here is that with events like this, that we can put our minds together and find better ways to handle this for future events that might come. That's the personal side of it. From a business side of it, when we first heard the announcement that everybody was, the border was closing, and I wear another hat. I am Vice President of Government Relations for Russell Farrow. It's Canada's largest independent customs broker. So for us, we represent large multinational companies that need to get goods that stock our shelves, here in Canada and the US. Sitting there in my office that day saying, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? The phones are ringing off the hook. Is the border closed to truck drivers? Is the border closed to essential travelers? And then there's the whole other side of it, which is not that personal and not the hardcore business, but rather the people who own homes on either sides of the border. I don't think people who do not live on border cities or don't work in this field understand how interconnected our border is. It's not linear. I have a home in Canada and a home in Detroit. And many people are like me that have that cross-border type of lifestyle, and it's second nature to most of us. Well, what I had the privilege of working with the orders in council that were released, and that is what enabled us at the Institute, with my own work, to assist companies and people to still get across that border. But from seeing the last 2 years and the money that has been lost, the companies who said, I don't want to do business if this is what I have to do to get into Canada, or then to get back into the US, I think we've seen a lot of suffering. There's been a lot of collateral damage from an economic perspective that really could have been avoided. The hope is that we can take those lessons learned from 9/11, where we worked in the background on trusted trader programs, and those programs were difficult at first. I won't say that they weren't, for companies to adopt, for people to adopt, whether you're using the Nexus program or the truck drivers who use FAST, but now it's become second nature. From a trade perspective, we've seen the steady flow of goods despite all of this, and I believe that that's part of the work that was done post 9/11 from a joint Canada-US perspective. I think we could utilize some of the things we learned from there and over the last 2 years to really improve what I've seen. I could talk for hours on this, but I'm gonna hand the floor back over to the next speaker, and happy to answer any questions as it relates to what I've talked about.
Thanks very much, Lori. And I hope you do write that book about the experience. It's important to bear witness and not forget these events. And you brought a really important dimension to our conversation. Now I'll turn the floor over to Jeff Ayers and to Stefano Tirina, and take it away, gentlemen.
Thanks a lot, Chris. I appreciate the invitation to be part of this. panel today, and also to have been invited earlier to be part of the research team. And my charge, I think, I'm up here in very snowy Winooski, Vermont today, where it seems to be getting colder by the minute. And my charge was to focus on sort of the local level. And that sort of, I think that fits very well as being a Vermonter. 35 miles at St. Michael's College, we're about 35 miles south of the Quebec border. I've been here 24 years and I teach a Canadian politics course and I take the French club to Montreal. So Lori's personal comments really hit home for me because I'm somebody who routinely went to Quebec almost once a month, maybe once every 6 weeks. And all of that was shut down. You know, the field trip, one of my good friends, Dave Massell, many of you know him, who teaches at the University of Vermont. We lead a field trip there annually to Ottawa, parliamentary field trip. That was disrupted. So a lot, in many ways, I appreciate the personal comments that were made. And that was really what my charge was. It was, I had my research project focused on the Eastern New York, really the Plattsburgh region, all the way across the Vermont border with Quebec. And, you know, I'm going to very quickly, I think I've been given, Stefano and I have been given a couple minutes, 3 or 4 minutes to go over these. The bottom line is this area has incredible ties, a historic Francophone heritage. If you've been to this region, if you go down minutes from Burlington right here, we have a Bienvenue Québécois program, the stickers all over the stores. We celebrate Saint Jean de Baptiste Day with the fleur de lis being put out on June 24th. And it's a bilingual airport. It was mentioned that 40% of our people that fly out are from Quebec. So there's a strong sense of, I think, a strong sense of a shared, you know, Francophone or bilingual characteristics. And there's deepening economic ties, deepening paradiplomatic ties, but these were significantly disrupted. And I'm going to very quickly look at sort of the 3 questions here. What were some of the disruptions, or what were some of the ways in which the border communities were reshaped? And of course, one of the main ways was economically. It was mentioned, particularly focusing on the tourism industry, that you know, Vermont's tourism industry took a huge hit from the loss of the majority of over 150 million injected into Vermont's economy by visiting Canadians. You mentioned the airport decreased by 70 to 80%, a decrease in passenger traffic, clearly due in part to the near elimination of Canadians who normally account for up to 40%, as was mentioned. And once the border closed to all non-essential traffic, the average cross-border passenger traffic was down 97%. And in my research on the ground, I drove up to the border. I talked to people in the classic Derby line area. So I did some case studies on the human dimension, which has been talked about, the ways in which people who were it's featured in New York Times and the National Geographic magazine, but the famous Haskell Free Library and Opera House in Stansted, Quebec, and Derby line, and how that was suddenly frozen. The Borderline Players, which is a arts group, a theater group that is a collaborative theater group across the border, that they had to postpone performances. The Border Jets, a young person's hockey team that straddles the border. You know, these are the kind of micro level personal disruptions that took place. The ski industry was huge. I mean, Jay Peak, I tend to ski down a little bit closer to this region in Smuggler's Notch, but Jay Peak, which is very close to the Quebec border, saw sales down between 30 to 40%. And that's a huge hope, is that the reopening of the border will see an increase in number of Quebecers coming in, mostly Quebecers, to Jay Peak and to helping with the revitalize the Vermont ski industry here. I'm just going to say a couple quick things, because research focused a lot on the implications. You know, we were also asked to quickly reflect on, well, what are the economic and social prospects for communities? And it's too early, right? I mean, I snuck up to Montreal twice in November and early December, once the border opened in pre-Omicron, but now with Omicron and the Omicron variant, there's a lot of hesitation I think on both sides, certainly here on my side, to travel. The testing protocols, I think, for many are still burdensome and confusing. The PCR requirement is frustrating for many. And our State Department, of course, still has Canada at a level 4 do not travel advisory. So so there's a number of things that are still in place. And I think it's going to take time. What are the implications? I think it will take time for people to feel comfortable as the virus recedes, regardless of what happens with testing protocols. And I really appreciated, Chris, the work your team did from the Wilson Center, because I agreed with one of its major conclusions, which was in the future, because there will be future pandemics, that we've got to, and everybody's emphasized this somewhat already, remember the local level, remember the impact of a border closure on the local level, and perhaps try to mitigate risk rather than shut down all non-essential travel. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Stefano, my neighbor in Maine.
Well, good afternoon, neighbor. And good afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much for having me here and allowing me to share some of my own research findings here in the state of Maine. Of course, I don't need to really go deep into explaining that the relationship between Maine and New Brunswick and Maine and Quebec is a very, very, very long history of cultural bonds, family bonds, historic bonds, economic bonds that go beyond the extent of the free trade agreement, first between Canada and the US, and of course the more trilateral agreement that then developed in the 1990s. So there is a history that was definitely interrupted by the abrupt closure of the border. And in the case of Maine, I just want to point out, although bilateral trade between Canada and Maine was altered at the level of tourism, and as mentioned as Chris, resulting in 6 million revenue losses. Trade, on the other hand, by truck commerce, the commerce of the free trade agreement did continue to move back and forth. So on paper, it seemed to be that things were moving okay, but at the level of the ground, families, communities, businesses that had been designed as a business plan to incorporate the bilateral dynamic of Canadians coming into Maine and Mainers going into Canada, that was completely destroyed. And when I say destroyed, I mean destroyed, because small businesses do not have the leisure of multinational corporations to simply ask for more funding or re-strategize. In the case of a small business, if the bilateral, if the border is closed and the business begins to fail, the small business owner has to reevaluate quickly its strategy based on its limited capacities and capabilities. And those businesses are not going to be looking at tailoring again to the Canadian border and the Canadian consumer and the Canadian tourist, simply because there is no time to wait. It was mentioned before by Chris that we're looking at a potential recovery of 5 years. 5 years for a small business is absolutely impossible. And therefore, most of the borderland golf courses, borderland events, borderland balloon festivals, snow events, all kinds of seasonal events have had to retailor their strategy to attract American tourists from New York, from other parts of the state, and even the state of Maine has invested into marketing the state to attract people from the United States, because before it was historically given that it was the Canadians who were coming into the beach, to the resorts, to the hotels, to the restaurants. And if you come to Maine, of course, you will see that in every town, no matter how distant and peripheral it is, there is a Canadian flag waving and waiting for Canadian people to come. It is family. These are historic ties that were cut very drastically. I'm talking about a 93% decrease in human traffic, tourist traffic. And of course, that is devastating for economies in the borderland towns that depended on the retail consumer coming from Canada, on the person coming to fill their gas tank in the US side, the person doing some shopping here and there, buying cookies, buying insignificant stuff. But of course, this insignificant stuff adds to millions and millions and millions of revenue for small towns that were basically dependent. I'm not even saying interdependent, but dependent on this Canadian dynamic. So one of my points that I concluded in my analysis is that, of course, free trade agreement, bilateral relations worked very well when things were going okay, but we've reached a point where policymakers and decision makers on both sides must reevaluate that the future of the bilateral relation could be in a certain way in doubt or in jeopardy because of the fact that that it's not only about bilateral trade of trucks and commerce, it's about people. And that these were the persons that were left out of the equation, the people. And of course, it is the people that then vote for policymakers that support the ideas of free trade and open markets. And if those people are not on the same page as the policymakers in the business sector, then there's going to be a big problem. And for the 1980s, the 1970s, the 1990s, it was clear for local communities that bilateral trade, bilateral commerce, and the interdependency increasing and incremental interdependency between the two regions was good for the person in Machias, or the person in Covent Garden, or the person in the periphery of Maine, which is in the periphery of the United States. But these are the same people that will then question free trade agreements, open markets, and the valuable things that, of course, are on the table here and that were taken for granted. And that, of course, as a result of this incident, a very important incident, then puts it on the table of doubt. And I'm not saying that we are looking like the European Union here, which is also another questionable situation as a result of the tightening of borders, which revealed that this free trade agreement, bilateral dynamics or trilateral or multilateral, were effective when things were good, but are very weak when things go bad. And that's something that perhaps we need to consider. One last thing I wanted to point out, as a result of this, even though I have mentioned that multinational corporations and massive international trade did continue, issues like the Clean Corridor were heavily impacted at the negotiating table as a result of the closure of the border. And of course, that the Hydro-Quebec initiative to move a green electricity through hydropower through Maine to reach the Massachusetts border was interrupted by the constituents themselves, who had a little bad taste in their mouth about this Canada-Maine relation, Canada-US relation that unfolded when the border was closed, and that for them seemed to be something to question. So the questioning is what I'm very interested in moving forward, and see how the dynamic of the population on the ground in the small business sector and the tourist sector will behave moving forward. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Stefano and Jeff. That was wonderful and really added layers of depth and nuance to what is, for many of us, just a nationwide, nation-to-nation conversation. I think you really do get to some important insights when you can get to some of the local realities. I want to remind those of you who are watching that we want to hear from you as well. There is a Q&A box on the Zoom webinar. It looks like two little cartoon balloons. And if you click on that and ask a question, we'll be happy to put it to our panelists and hopefully get you a prompt answer. But since we don't have a question yet, I'm going to throw one out just to see what you're all thinking. After 9/11, it took a while after September 11th, but we came to rely on local port directors for customs or CBSA to kind of work with the local business community, engage with the traveling public, and be sort of the first line of communication. It seems as though, maybe this is the wrong perception, but it seems as though in response to the pandemic, rather than empowering our border officials, we focused on public health officials, the CDC, the Public Health Agency of Canada, which broke that local link. Do you think that's a fair characterization, that to some extent, customs and CBSA had the tools to connect with local communities, but were not the decision makers here, complicating to some extent some of the phenomena that you've all identified. That's a broad question. Christophe, can I put that to you first, perhaps, and then see who else would like to jump in?
Well, I have to admit that I was in 8th grade in September during the September 11 attacks, so I was not monitoring these developments. But I think I think I have to agree with your intuition that there was a lot of well, I am especially talking, of course, from a Canada and Quebec standpoint. That it's mostly about the public health authorities, I guess, but I'm not quite sure how exactly all the actors are taken into consideration when decision making is made. But I'll be very interesting to hear what the other panelists have to say on this matter.
Anyone want to jump in? Laura, you had your comments really bore on some of these questions. Can I ask you to jump in?
Certainly. So you definitely hit the nail on the head. You know, we had a number of working groups, border groups that oftentimes we had port directors right here locally who would come and help the stakeholders, right? Just come up with solutions and what's next. If I've heard anything resoundingly clear in these last 2 years from both CBSA and CBP and CBSA, it's that it's out of our hands. Sorry, this is public health. We're not the ones mandating this quarantine. We're not the ones asking for these PCR tests. We're not the ones rolling out this policy. For a period of time, we had public health officials right here posted at the border. Never seen anything like that, right? Where they're there and you know, both Canada and the US share this same philosophy, meaning that those cross-border, those customs agencies are the ones that enforce policy for multiple other participating agencies and groups. This was the first time that they were sort of said, hey, step aside, we're here now. The problem is that public health officials know public health issues, understand epidemiological, scientific, health, medical, but they don't understand the makeup of the border and how complicated it is and everything that officer has to take into consideration, because it was almost like they had to stop looking or couldn't focus on the enforcement side of things, contraband, drugs, human trafficking issues, weapons. It was just the focus was, do you have your PCR test? Because without that, they were going to be the ones that were held accountable. So I think you definitely hit the nail on the head. And I think that was a big part of the problem that we saw.
Jeff, Stefano, anything on this particular point? Always have more questions.
Just had a quick anecdote to mention.
Go ahead, Steph.
The relationship of border agents with local community members that move back and forth on a daily basis was a very intimate and close relationship. And those relationships were heavily altered by the policy itself, where you would cross the border every day to see your aunt, your uncle, your brother, your sister, your wife, your significant other, and then one day to the next, after you've been doing this for the past 7, 10, 12, 15 years, suddenly you're said you cannot come back, and you are friends. You had relationships, intimate relationships, and the relationships were destroyed by the fact that you had to enforce the policy. And of course, returning back to normal, those individuals will still be in the border executing their job, but they will not have that same rapport that they had built at the community level. And this is going to take much more than just changing direction. It will be building human relations from the bottom up one more time.
I was just going to say really quickly that I think there were two issues come to mind. One is, I think there's a kind of a mistaken belief that both Canada and the United States were, deeply collaborating in the closure of this border. Like, so on the one hand, I think there was that was a missed opportunity in that there wasn't good collaboration. In fact, I think when I read your report, you had a very detailed comparison of how it was. The announcements came out at the same time, and they bumped ahead by every 30 days. But I think, and I think there's political reasons for that. Obviously, I mean, if we go back in time, and compare how the pandemic was unfolding. It was, we could talk about those political, but I think it was somewhat advantageous from a Canadian federal perspective to keep the border more tightly closed, but it also was playing out in the same way for the Trump administration. So there was both a lack of, I think, coordination cross-border between the two countries, but it also was a disempowering at the local and state level. And one of the things, and I'm not criticizing my congressional representatives, but I was struck by Leahy, Sanders, and Welch. And we only have three. We have one congressional representative and two senators, but how they would be, frequently saying, if we want the border open, if it was up to us, we'd have the border open, border would be open sooner, with precautions or what have you, but to non-essential traffic, but it's out of our hands because it is a, public health issue. So it was across the lake as well. New York's representatives were frustrated. So that's something we have to think through. And why is it that even at, not just at the state level, but at the congressional level, our representatives seemed pretty disempowered. There weren't that many hearings. I don't think the political process was used very well or had much of an effect during this time. And that's something I think we need to think through more.
Thanks very much for that, Jeff. Just a reminder, you can put questions into the Q&A box here. Anyone who's watching wants to ask a question, please jump in. But I have another question of my own. Maybe the previous discussion sort of explains part of it, but I want to ask about information. The border after 9/11 moved to a risk management paradigm on the understanding that you can never be 100% convinced there's no terrorism. And probably as we've gotten used to the variants and so on, and of course there are going to be future flus and other things, I think we're coming to realize that we'll never be completely zero risk for COVID or something else that might cross the border. But how do you convey PCR tests, vaccination status, et cetera, to a border official who isn't a public health official? That strikes me as a very important problem. And we have the ArriveCan app that Canada's put out, but of course, nothing similar on the US side. We have people bringing CDC vaccination cards that are pretty easy to print off the internet and just has a bunch of scribbling on it from a doctor. I hope I'm not offending doctors for your bad handwriting, but that's often the case. Sometimes it's a nurse. How can we create a data platform so that people who have to enforce policies like this, when people come to them at the border, they know that it's a reliable, not a forged document? It seems to me the risk management requires data, and data requires some sort of way that you can convey your status. And a lot of people don't want to take their vaccine card. They just have a photo on their phone. But can we think about how we share data, especially personal private data, in the context of the border? Could we do more to help people judge what's the risk of an individual crossing? Broad question. Any takers? Yeah, Lori, please.
I'll start off the conversation here. So, from a customs perspective, right, because I switch between my customs and my immigration hat, we in Canada followed suit to the US with the implementation of our single window initiative program from a customs perspective. This was a huge overhaul for Canadian and non-resident importers into Canada who had to change all the way that things were done. Everything was by paper before. So similar to what you're talking about, I'd have to bring my certificate of origin as a driver, hand that to the customs officer. He'd have to, or she'd have to verify that what I say is in my truck, right? The single window initiative, along with the ACE program in the US, overhauled this very manual paper-based environment, turned it into this automated environment where for many years there were stakeholders, round tables, importers, exporters, government officials, customs officials who said, okay, wait a second, we don't just need customs information, we need health information, we need Environment Canada, we need FDA. So what the single window initiative does is it basically brings together all of the advanced trade data from all of these participating government agencies, from the importer themselves, all the way down their supply chain into one portal. the way I envision this, and you know, Dr. Anderson and Marta Anderson, both of the three of us at the Institute, we talk about this often, that what we envision would be a similar situation, right? Where, to your point, Chris, those cards could be uploaded into this one system that both Canadian and US officials would have access to. They'd be able to verify it. Something like that would take time. I mean, the single window initiative wasn't built overnight, neither was ACE, but these programs work very smoothly right now. So that would be my suggestion if I had to give one off the cuff.
Anyone else want to jump in on this question? We do have a few questions from the audience as well.
I did want to comment, Christopher, that this is more of a macro vision, but I think one of the lessons from this experience is that there has to be a greater attention on facilitating and perhaps coordinating the movement of people, not so much trade, but people, so that we can recover that loss of exchange of tourists moving back and forth. And of course, perhaps building a more integrated border, which is of course in the vision of a future free trade zone, is that we can put all our paperwork together so that we as Canadians and we as Americans can of course move freely like we did before 9/11, which then of course was the boom of this bilateral movement of people, which led to the building of this borderland economies that were heavily impacted. So it is perhaps an opportunity for policymakers to look at how to facilitate movement of people one more time.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Stefano. We have a question from one of our Vermont partners. So maybe Jeff, you might want to jump in on this first, but it's a question about equity, that particularly for poorer residents, you know, the fees for some of the PCR tests and so on are a bit of a barrier. We haven't come up with a way necessarily for people who are of modest means to be able to access the border. It seems if you can spend the money, you can do it, but it's very hard on some local communities which are not flush with cash. Do you think that that this has been an additional bitterness in terms of the border restrictions, that it has been the only ways you can move forward is if you can spend money? For example, to fly to Montreal or fly back from Montreal, that's fine, but to drive over in your old car might not be as easy. What can you tell us about equity issues with regard to border access in this pandemic?
Singling me out on that just because it was a Vermonter who sent that in. I actually looked at both of those questions super quick while you were talking, because they're back to back and they seem to be, I'll take a broader look at both of them, and they seem to be concerned about how do we rebuild rapport, you know, across the border, both because of perhaps people, because of equity concerns. Because, you know, I thought about it myself, by the way. So I have the ReefCan app, and I have access to the internet, and I can easily upload it, and it was a piece of cake for me to go to the border. In fact, I was surprised when I showed the letter of my negative test, that the Canadian official said, well, I don't need your phone. I have all your information already. I mean, it was very efficient, but I know that many people don't have access to those types of technologies, or the equity issue is an important one. But I also wanted to, I'll include it with the next question, just because I agree that I think there's a sense of that. There's a sense on this side of the border that Canadians wanted the border closed and wanted to keep it closed, you know, for longer. And it's not a criticism but I think there's a feeling, how do we at the local level, and I don't know the answer to this, I'm sharing that rapport, or I'm sharing that concern. How do we reconnect with our neighbors to the north, and remove suspicion that that Americans aren't all infected with the virus, or that we're not all ignorant of health protocols and such. I do know that it's easier in Vermont. It is easier in Vermont to have access. We have a very good public health system here, and we've had up until recently with the Omicron variant, it was much easier to get access to testing. Even though I'm sympathetic to equity concerns, I think they were more significant on the Quebec side. I think it was more expensive to get, if I'm not mistaken, to get PCR tests than it was on our side. But I'm interested in hearing other people's thoughts on how do we rebuild rapport between both sides at the local level. I'm concerned about that as well.
Christophe, two-fingered intervention, I see.
Yeah, just a quick intervention, but I would also try to answer the two questions. But what strikes me about the question about the inequity is that it seems to be linked to what has been said earlier about the other panelists about the lack of consideration for border communities and people who live by the reality of the border. And it seems, once again, from a Canadian perspective, that the border opening issues for non-essential travel is essentially framed as a leisure issue. So we're talking about people that will be able to go back to weekends in Boston, in New York, in Las Vegas, but we're not taking into account realities of people that live on the side of the border and work on the other side. There are not many people in Canada, I think, that knows the reality of people in Windsor that works in Detroit and well on the Quebec and even in Quebec we are not really taking into account people that live really near the border. So I think it's an issue here about the lack of consideration, or at least taking into account a certain reality of people that are deeply affected. And once again, Professor Tiarina and Harris, you talk about the personal side of this, and I think it's not been taken really into account, not only by politicians and deciders, but also by journalists and people who cover this issue. And for the question of the trust, and I would say that I have the impression that it's fairly cyclical, the trust that is between Canadian and Americans. And as I said during my presentation, I guess we don't want to be too political here, but I guess that the Trump years were something of a rough patch on the Canadian-American side of things. And I remember that in the summer of 2020, when Donald Trump, of course, was still president, and the COVID-19 seemed not to be a huge priority for this administration. Well, there was a sense in Canada that the Americans were acting irresponsibly. And we saw in the many polls that were taken back then that Canadians, as you said, Professor Ayers, were much more in favor of keeping the border closed. And there was also act of violence against Americans with American immatriculation plate that were coming from the west to Alaska. They have the right, of course, to travel through Canada, but there was act of vandalism against their cars. So it was, of course, very unfortunate. But I guess that rebuilding this trust is part of the long recovery that will come after the COVID pandemic.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stefano. There's a question that's come in which kind of links this, and it goes to the status of truck drivers and the new vaccination requirements that both governments have been talking about with regard to cross-border trucking. One of the ironies of the early move to designate truck traffic as essential was that we had drivers going back and forth with no vaccine testing requirement, no vaccination requirement. We had a program, CT-PAT, FAST, which could have required major shippers to add vaccination as a requirement of staying in the program, and they do that voluntarily, but we didn't take advantage of that. Looking at where we are now, what will happen to the truck driving community, and how will they be affected by these new vaccination requirements, which you can justify certainly for public health, but have been somewhat suddenly rolled out, leaving people kind of scrambling to make sure they can get their goods back and forth when we're already in a supply chain crisis. Any comments on that requirement, how it was handled, and even on that notion that some travel is essential because of its purpose rather than allowed to cross because it represents a smaller risk? I must have caught that one so well.
I can touch on that. You know, I think so Canada required it as of January 15th, and the US required it for truck drivers as of January 22nd. So part of the issue was that this sort of came all at once, right? I think had there been better coordination between the two countries, perhaps there could have been a staggering as opposed to slamming the trucking industry all at once, because that's essentially what it's done. Now, Do I think that truck drivers pose a significant threat? They're in their trucks for hours at a time. They're at cross-docking locations. They're socially distanced. I mean, they're not an industry that I think is one that is really threatening to Canadians or Americans, right? And again, I'm an attorney. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor, right? So I'm speaking from that perspective. But from what I see in terms of how well I know what they do on a day-to-day basis, I don't think the threat was that imminent to have imposed this. The problem is that we did have supply chain issues. There was a time when Prime Minister Trudeau was thanking the truckers as being essential workers. We've heard that rhetoric and that messaging for the last 2 years from everyone. Thank you, truck drivers. Now all of a sudden we're saying, oh, sorry, we gave you an out, but now you don't have it anymore, right? Without really any data or evidence or science to back it up. So it's a bit troublesome that they just sort of say, oh, this is what's happening and this is how it's happening without really any preparation. And to your point, Chris, those systems were in place. We could have done this on a gradual implementation basis as opposed to as of this date, if you don't have it, sorry. And so I think it did catch, although, I mean, I've known about it, right? People have known about it, but it doesn't change the fact that there's already a shortage of truck drivers because of immigration issues, because of other issues, right? So not looking at that and just sort of applying the same policy across the board. I can't remember, maybe it was you, Chris, that said it, but we've got, each port operates different. Windsor, Detroit, between the tunnel and the bridge, there are differences, there are inconsistencies, and that's in 2 cities here, right?
Mhm.
So the fact that we applied the same policy across all of Canada and the US at every port of entry, it's not functional and it's not practical. And sorry, for anybody looking for free tests, CVS and Walgreens offer free tests and get them back between 36 and 48 hours, and they have them in most states. So, a lot of my clients ask for that. So just throwing that out there for anybody.
Very good. And Peter Howe has jumped into the questions with, I think, a reminder that we've had a very bleak view of things, and we don't want to send people out, depressed. The weekend is coming. So Peter asked if you have any reflections on silver linings, things that worked well, some sign that at least there was some good cooperation from your research. Is there any bright spot, anything you want to count as having gone better than you expected, or having been done in a thoughtful way? Stefano.
Not necessarily answering your question, but do pointing out a very positive thing. Out of a crisis, out of a problem, out of a mistake, the outcome is that now the 2 countries can go back to the drawing board and say, our free trade dynamic must be tweaked to make sure that in the future we become more integrated, more interdependent, but that will also involve at the local level, the borderland regions. It is a good opportunity to reveal to the policymakers at the federal level that they need to coordinate with the policymakers at the local level and at the regional level, because now there is a clear importance on the table that there is interdependence that cannot just be thrown away out the window every time that there's a crisis. And that's, to me, is very positive in the future buildup of tighter and more interdependent bilateral relations between the 2 economies.
I'm going to say something super quick.
Yes.
After talking about the difficulties related to the human dimension, I will at least say that we bounced back reasonably well around essential services. Like that was a silver lining. I mean, think about how fearful we were, people around the world were in March of 2020, that this pandemic was coming on, and I think that is a silver lining, that in a very short period of time, these 2 countries, maintained essentials, essential services, essential trade, and so forth. So that's, as opposed to just completely shutting down. And I'm hopeful what Stefano said is everything I'm reading, it says what we've learned is we've got to think more about the local level and the human dimension. So I think we will see hopefully some type of decentralization and a lack of a complete harmonization of border policy across the country.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's now, we've hit the time where I need to introduce Roger Kusner, who is Consul General of Canada in Boston. Roger, over to you. Well, I hope. Roger, where are you? There.
Are we there?
You're there.
I don't know if my microphone situation has ratified or not, if it's healed over the last little bit. It's better. Well, listen, that was fabulous. Let me start by thanking Peter Howe and the NECBC. We've worked a number of events with Peter and his crew, and they're great to deal with, as is Marie-Claude Francoeur, and thank her for setting the table up front, and the government of Quebec for the study, and all that she does on so many, broad issues. Dr. Chris Sands, you did a great job. Chris Wallace-Worthy sort of moderating this astute panel. Thank you for your excellent work with the Wilson Center. And I think, one of the things I got from your comments, the failure to be able to weigh the local factors, I think is significant. And there's nothing more true. Dr. Cloutier-Roy, 1.5 billion in trade exports lost, in travel exports lost. I think that that really drives the point home. Plus the invisible impacts. I think that is something that we don't look at enough. The research that you've shown with the lag in the recovery, 3 to 5 years, is substantial. And I would hope that policymakers weigh that going forward when it comes to support for workers and in business. Lori, I kidded Lori on our practice call the other day. I said, I want to make sure you do a good job. She said, don't worry. She said, I'll let you know my true feelings on it. And she didn't let us down. The benefit of having learned lessons from 9/11, that tragedy, maybe, we were a little bit better positioned during this pandemic, but I don't know if there was anything that could really prepare us for this. And speaking about the changing nature of the pandemic, and I know that whenever our office was contacted about, the information, we would continually refer them to the website to make sure that they were getting the most up to date, because it was ever evolving. I could obviously sense your frustration with the public health officials having the hammer as opposed to border officials. I know the essence of it was that before we can continue with trade or with whatever, we have to get healthy first, but not having that understanding of all the other issues around it, I think, was probably made it difficult for everybody. As far as the current trucker situation, and just your comment on that, I know that notice was given in November, and many of the big trucking companies, certainly here in the States and many in Canada as well, had made those changes and reassigned a lot of their personnel to more domestic routes, and use those vaccinated in their workforce to do the cross-border stuff. Dr. Ayers, your comments, what I got from that is that there was a real awakening about just how interconnected and interrelated the two nations are. Your point on the local officials not seeming to have a voice, what we were getting from Washington, our folks in Washington were not getting that real sense of urgency from the White House about the northern border. Obviously, both borders were shut, and the southern border and all its complications and the issues around the southern border, and they had the two tied. And I think maybe that took some of the focus away from the economic impacts and the other impacts on the northern border. But it didn't, I know Canadians were concerned about the border, but we weren't getting that sense of urgency from Washington. I think, border officials did a great job, especially initially, to keep the trucks rolling and the goods moving. PPE was moved across the border. There was the issue about the N95 masks, and the former president didn't want any N95 masks going to Canada. But then when he realized that the pulp for the filters was made in Canada, we were able to get access to the N95 masks. And it's just another testament as to how interconnected we are as the two countries. So kudos to the border officials for keeping the trucks and the people in that industry to keep the trucks rolling. And you look at Laurie in Detroit and Windsor, there are hundreds of nurses and health professionals in Windsor that cross the border on an almost daily basis to provide services for the people in Detroit that were so hard hit. Stefano, your comments about it being not just about trade and numbers, that it's about people, I think that's it's imperative to understand the depth of that. When you're trying to balance public health, trade, security issues, but it's about the physical, mental, emotional, and even spiritual impacts on people. I think we're going to feel that for a while to come, and it's going to take a number of years to get past this. It's going to be a walk back. I'm a Toronto Maple Leaf fan, so I'm used to disappointment, getting my hopes up and then to be disappointed in the end. But by all indicators and all the professionals that you have an opportunity to listen to, there are brighter days ahead, and the spring might not be too bad. The number of times the word unprecedented has been used in the last 2 years is unprecedented. We haven't been through anything like this before. We will go through it again, most likely, but know that the insight and the substantive discussion around these issues today will certainly arm myself and my staff much better when we bring these issues to Ottawa. So I want to thank each and every one of you for your contributions today and for the work that you continue to do on behalf of the workers and the businesses on both sides of this border. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure if Peter or someone else is going to come back, so maybe I'll just jump in here to say thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time. We've come to the end of our time. Thank you, Consul General. Thank you to Marie-Claude Foncoeur for sponsoring the research. Thanks to all of our panelists who've been tremendous, and thanks to the New England Canadian Business Council for pulling us all together. It's been a great event. I hope we can do this again sometime soon. But for now, have a great weekend.